In the quiet rhythm of ancient life, food was not just nourishment, it was survival. And to survive, people needed to master the art of keeping food fresh long after it was harvested or hunted. Without refrigerators, freezers, or modern packaging, ancient communities relied on clever, simple, and often beautiful methods to preserve their daily sustenance. Imagine the early farmer standing beside a field of ripened grain, knowing that within a short span, all of it must be harvested. The problem was not just gathering the harvest, but ensuring that it would last through the cold winters, the dry summers, and unexpected times of scarcity. That is where storage came in. A quiet science, a craft that turned raw harvests into sustenance that could be relied upon months later. One of the oldest and most common methods was the cellar. The idea was simple. The earth itself, with its steady, cool temperature, became a natural refrigerator. In many regions, people dug deep pits or underground rooms to store food. These cellars kept the sun's heat away and shielded supplies from rain and wind. Grain, root vegetables like carrots and turnips, and even barrels of wine or ale would rest in these underground spaces, waiting patiently to be used. Picture a medieval or even ancient cellar, rough stone walls, damp and cool, with wooden shelves stacked with clay jars and woven baskets. The air is heavy with the smell of earth, mingled with dried herbs hanging from beams. In such spaces, life's essentials were guarded carefully, a treasure more valuable than gold. Clay jars themselves played a central role in food storage. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, and China, jars were the universal container. Their shapes varied, some tall and narrow for oils and wines, others wide and stout for grains. Sealed with wax, resin, or cloth, these jars kept out pests and slowed down spoilage. In many archaeological sites, jars have been found still containing traces of grain, wine, or honey, silent witnesses to meals eaten thousands of years ago. Imagine lifting a clay jar, heavy with stored wheat, its rounded form cool to the touch, its surface etched with the marks of a potter's hand. This was more than a container. It was a lifeline. Families would rely on these jars to carry them through lean months when fresh harvests were long gone. Then there were ice pits, a fascinating invention that showed how ancient people used the natural environment to their advantage. Long before mechanical ice making, people harvested winter ice from frozen lakes and rivers, then buried it deep underground, insulated with straw, wood, or even animal hides. In Persia, vast yakhchals were built, dome-like structures with thick walls of mud brick that kept ice solid well into the blazing summers. Picture a yakhchal under the desert sun. On the outside, it appears as a large dome rising from the earth. On the inside, its deep pit remains cool and shadowed, filled with blocks of ice, carefully stacked, waiting for use. Water, milk, fruits, and even meats could be cooled here, long before the concept of a refrigerator ever existed. And then, of course, there was salt, that simple mineral that transformed the history of preservation. Salt drew moisture out of food, slowing down the growth of bacteria. Fish salted along the coasts of the Mediterranean could be transported far inland. Meat rubbed with salt could survive journeys across continents. Even butter could be salted to last longer. In fact, entire trade routes were built around salt, often called white gold. The scene is clear. In a dimly lit ancient kitchen, a family carefully layers fish between sheets of coarse salt. They press it down, pack it tight, and set it aside. Days later, the fish is firm, preserved, and ready for a meal that might come weeks or even months into the future. These methods, cellars, jars, ice pits, and salt, were not merely about practicality. They shaped economies, influenced trade, and even guided wars. An army could not march without stored food. A village could not thrive without safe reserves. And entire civilizations built their strength not just on crops in the field, but on the ability to make those crops last. Every tool of preservation carried with it a story. A jar etched with symbols might tell us of a potter's skill. A salt pit might reveal a community's access to trade. An underground cellar might whisper of family dinners, long since eaten, but sustained by the quiet patience of stored food. Through these practices, ancient people managed to tame time itself, capturing the freshness of summer to be eaten in winter, holding back hunger with the simple wisdom of preservation. The story of food storage is not only about the methods, but also about the rhythm of life that revolved around them. Every season brought its own challenges, and with those challenges came the need for preservation. In spring, when new crops sprouted, the pressure was lightened. Fresh greens filled the table, rivers offered fish, and the world felt abundant. Yet, even in spring, people thought ahead, drying herbs, preparing jars for the harvest to come, and repairing old cellars battered by winter dampness. By summer, abundance overflowed. Fruits ripened, grains were cut, vegetables filled the fields. It was a season of both joy and urgency. If the summer's harvest was not carefully stored, it would spoil quickly, leaving families vulnerable during the coming cold months. Farmers and families moved quickly, working together, turning fresh harvests into stores that would last. Grain, the backbone of so many ancient diets, had to be carefully handled. After threshing and winnowing, the clean kernels were dried in the sun before being stored in jars, bins, or underground silos. If moisture seeped in, mold would grow. If cracks appeared, rats and insects would invade. Grain storage was so vital that entire communities sometimes built granaries, large communal storage houses where food for many families could be guarded and rationed if needed. Imagine walking into such a granary, wooden beams supporting a roof, large clay bins lined along the walls, each filled to the brim with golden grain. Dust fills the air as handfuls are scooped out. The smell of earth and straw surrounds you, a reminder of the preciousness of each kernel. This was not just food, it was life held in waiting. Fruits, too, had their own ways of preservation. Grapes could be dried into raisins, figs pressed into cakes, apples stored in cool cellars where their skins would protect the flesh inside for months. In some places, fruits were submerged in honey or thick syrups where the natural sugars acted like salt, preserving their sweetness. Even in Egypt, archaeologists have found jars of honey still edible after thousands of years. Nature's own preservative, guarding flavor across centuries. Vegetables were stored in root cellars. Carrots, turnips, beets, and cabbages thrived in the cool darkness. Some were buried directly in sand or straw, each layer insulating them from rot. Others were pickled in vinegar or brine, transforming their flavor, but keeping them edible long after the growing season ended. Picture a root cellar at the edge of a small village. The door creaks open, cool air rushes out, and inside, rows of baskets hold turnips and onions. Bundles of dried herbs hang overhead, adding their fragrance to the damp, earthy smell. A child, holding a candle, follows a parent to fetch what will become that evening's stew. These humble spaces, though simple, were the very heart of survival. Meat posed a greater challenge. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially in warm climates. But salt, smoke, and sometimes ice pits gave a solution. Salting meat was common. Slabs of pork or beef were rubbed with coarse salt and left to cure. Over time, the salt worked its way into the flesh, drawing out moisture, leaving behind something that could last for weeks or even months. Smoking was another answer. In many villages, smokehouses or simple hearths doubled as preservation chambers. Meat was hung high above smoldering fires, where the smoke curled around it, drying and flavoring it at once. This smoky preservation gave rise to flavors still beloved today. But for ancient people, the importance was practical. Smoke kept away insects and bacteria, making meat edible long after the hunt was over. And then there was dairy. Milk soured within hours in the heat. But ancient people found clever ways to preserve it. Butter, when salted, could last far longer. Cheese, discovered almost by accident, became one of the most enduring forms of preservation. Curds, pressed and aged in caves or cellars, could be stored for months, even years. In some cultures, cheese itself became a kind of stored wealth, traded or gifted, carrying nourishment across distance and time. Water and drinks were stored carefully too. Wells gave fresh water, but for travel or long-term keeping, clay jars sealed with resin or wax were used. Fermented drinks, beer, ale, and wine, kept even longer, with alcohol acting as a natural preservative. In many medieval villages, ale was safer to drink than water because the brewing process killed harmful bacteria. Thus, preservation shaped not just meals, but daily life itself. As we move deeper into the ancient kitchen, we see a balance of wisdom and necessity. Every item had a place, every method a purpose. Preservation was not luxury, it was survival, and it was done with patience, with hands that understood the earth, the seasons, and the fragile nature of life. In the silence of those cellars and the coolness of those jars, humanity learned to master time, stretching abundance into scarcity, turning fragility into endurance. And though the tools were simple, the knowledge was profound. To truly appreciate the art of ancient food storage, we must step into the lives of ordinary people. Their survival depended on these methods. Their peace of mind came not from luxuries, but from knowing that, tucked away in a cellar or jar, there was food enough to last until the next harvest. Think of a small farming family. The father works the fields, sowing and harvesting. The mother prepares meals, dries herbs, and carefully stores vegetables in baskets lined with straw. Children carry clay jars from the potter, their little hands smudged with earth. Together, this family builds a buffer against hunger. Their daily routines revolve not only around what they eat today, but what they can save for tomorrow. Food storage was, in many ways, the invisible backbone of community life. A good harvest meant joy, but only if that harvest could be stored safely. A bad harvest meant fear, sometimes even famine, unless reserves from earlier years had been preserved wisely. Thus, the ability to store food became as important as the ability to grow or hunt it. In larger societies, food storage also influenced power and politics. Rulers and kings understood that a secure supply of grain or salt was more valuable than treasure. Ancient Egypt's wealth, for example, was not only in gold, but in the Nile's fertile fields and the enormous granaries that lined its cities. These granaries, massive storehouses filled with wheat and barley, allowed the state to feed workers, pay laborers, and withstand droughts. Picture one of those Egyptian granaries, high mud brick walls rising under the desert sun, ramps leading up where baskets of grain are poured inside. Within, thousands of sacks rest in cool shade, guarded by officials recorded on scrolls. The food here does not just fill stomachs, it fuels pyramids, temples, and armies. Without storage, there could be no monuments, no empire. The same was true in Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, and China. Grain stores became symbols of stability and control. Wars were fought not only for land, but for access to salt mines, fertile valleys, and safe storage routes. A broken granary or a failed preservation method could mean the collapse of entire communities. But while rulers thought in terms of kingdoms, ordinary people thought in terms of families. Preservation methods became traditions, passed down through generations. In one village, salted fish might be a winter staple. In another, smoked meats. In yet another, jars of dried beans or peas provided the base of countless meals. The rhythms varied, but the goal was always the same: to stretch the bounty of one season into the hunger of another. In colder regions, nature itself offered assistance. Winter was the great refrigerator. People stored meat outside, buried beneath snow, or in sheds where freezing temperatures acted as a natural preservative. Ice pits, as mentioned earlier, extended this power even into the warmer months. Blocks of ice, cut and stored during winter, provided coolness long into spring or summer. Imagine the scene: men cutting thick blocks of ice from a frozen river, hauling them with ropes and sleds. They stack the blocks in a pit lined with straw, covering them carefully to keep out the sun. Weeks later, when the world outside is warm, the pit still holds its treasure of ice for travelers, merchants, or households. This meant milk could last a little longer, drinks could be cooled, fruits kept fresher. Meanwhile, in warmer climates, where ice was a rare luxury, salt took center stage. Salt preserved meat and fish, but it also preserved vegetables. Pickling, a process of immersing food in brine, became a widely used method. Cabbages, cucumbers, even olives were transformed in salty baths, their flavors sharpened, their lifespans extended. Archaeologists have uncovered jars of pickled goods from centuries ago, evidence that this method not only fed families, but created flavors beloved across cultures. To this day, pickled foods remain staples, born of necessity, but continued for taste. Honey, too, was precious. Beyond its sweetness, it was a natural preservative. Fruits submerged in honey kept their shape and flavor for long periods. Nuts and seeds mixed into honey became dense, nutritious cakes that could be carried on long journeys. Honey's antibacterial properties made it almost magical in its ability to resist decay. To store food in honey was to wrap it in sweetness and safety at once. And so, the ancient household became a world of preservation, a cellar with baskets of root vegetables, jars of grain stacked in corners, smoked meats hanging from beams, pots of pickled vegetables sealed with wax, honey-filled containers glowing golden in torchlight. Each item had its place, each method its season. When the family gathered at the table, The meal was not just about taste, it was about trust that the efforts of months past had secured the food of today. Preservation created continuity. It linked summer to winter, harvest to hunger, and past to future. The wisdom of these methods grew slowly, shaped by trial and error. A jar poorly sealed meant spoilage. A pit dug too shallow meant heat seeped in. Too little salt meant rot. Too much smoke made meat bitter. Over time, people perfected the balance, and that knowledge, once learned, was guarded carefully, passed down like a secret inheritance. Thus, food storage was more than a task. It was a quiet art, a form of survival disguised as routine. Through it, families endured, villages thrived, and civilizations rose. In every corner of the ancient world, food storage reflected not only survival, but also creativity. People did not simply pile food away. They built systems, rituals, and traditions around the act of preserving. Over time, these systems became part of culture, shaping the way communities ate, traded, and even celebrated. Take, for example, the simple clay jar. While at first it was just a container, over centuries it became a symbol of preservation itself. In Greece and Rome, amphorae were designed specifically to carry oil, wine, and grains. Their tall, narrow shapes could be stacked efficiently in ships, allowing traders to move preserved foods across seas. Some amphorae were even stamped with marks, telling buyers where the food inside came from and when it was stored. Imagine a bustling Mediterranean harbor. Ships docked, their holds filled with rows upon rows of amphorae. Dock workers lift the jars, their arms straining under the weight. Merchants inspect the seals, ensuring that no air or water has spoiled the contents. These jars are more than pottery. They are passports for food, enabling olives grown in Greece to reach markets in Egypt, or wine from Italy to travel as far as Gaul. In China, large storage vessels played a similar role. Huge earthenware jars, sometimes as tall as a person, were used to store grains, soybeans, oils, and even fermented sauces. These jars were sealed with cloth, mud, or clay, protecting their contents for months or years. Families measured their wealth, not only in fields or livestock, but in how many jars stood safely stored in their homes. Then there were the cellars and underground chambers, which varied from place to place. In northern Europe, root cellars were dug into hillsides or beneath cottages. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, where the ground was drier, underground silos held grain for entire villages. In the Andes, people used cool mountain caves to keep potatoes and maize fresh. Each region adapted to its climate, finding ways to harness the earth itself as a tool for preservation. Let us picture a medieval European root cellar. The doorway is small, just high enough for a person to crouch through. Inside, the walls are lined with stone, the air cool and damp. Wooden shelves carry clay pots of pickled vegetables. On the floor, baskets of potatoes and onions sit covered with straw. Strings of garlic and dried herbs hang from the rafters. A faint drip of water echoes from the wall, reminding anyone who enters that here, beneath the earth, time moves slowly. These underground storehouses did more than keep food fresh. They gave families peace of mind. On long winter nights, when snow covered the fields and nothing grew outside, the cellar offered quiet assurance. A trip down the steps with a candle in hand meant a meal could still be prepared. Without such spaces, the cold months would have been times of hunger, fear, and hardship, the ice pits and yakhchals of Persia showed even greater ingenuity. A yakhchal was not only an ice storage facility, but also an architectural wonder. Its massive dome-like structure was built with a special mud brick called saruj, which resisted heat. Inside, the temperature stayed astonishingly low, even in the desert. Water, food, and ice stored within remained cool throughout the hottest months. At night, when temperatures dropped, water channels directed cool air into the yakhchal, chilling the ice further. During the day, the thick walls reflected sunlight, keeping the inside safe. These structures were so advanced that some of them still stand today, silent monuments to ancient wisdom. Meanwhile, in India, people used stone or brick structures, called stepwells, not only to collect water, but also to keep food cool. The lower steps of these wells were shaded and moist, creating natural refrigeration. Villagers would sometimes hang pots of milk or curds near the water line, where they stayed fresher, longer. Such ingenuity shows how closely tied food storage was to local geography and climate. Another key method across many lands was drying. Unlike salt or ice, drying needed no special resources, only sun, wind, and patience. Hunters in North America dried strips of meat into jerky. Farmers in the Middle East laid figs and dates on rooftops to dry in the sun. In Asia, fish was split and hung on racks to dry in the open air. Drying removed moisture, leaving food light, compact, and long-lasting. Picture a desert village at midday. Rows of dates lie spread on woven mats, their skins wrinkling under the sun. Children chase one another around the racks of drying fish, while elders carefully turn the fruits to ensure even drying. The air is filled with the mingling smells of sweetness and salt, a living reminder of preservation at work. Salt, smoke, honey, jars, pits, and cellars, each method became a story of adaptation. But these methods were not only about keeping food edible, they also changed how food tasted, creating new flavors that became cultural staples. Pickled vegetables developed tangy notes that people grew to love. Smoked meats carried rich, savory flavors that became part of tradition. Even dried fruits, concentrated and sweet, became delicacies for feasts and offerings to gods. Thus, storage shaped cuisine itself. Without preservation, diets would have been plain, limited to what was fresh in the moment. But with it, people discovered new tastes, new combinations, and new traditions. Food storage, in a way, was the quiet inventor of culture. It is worth remembering that these efforts were not always successful. Spoilage was a constant enemy. A poorly sealed jar, a damp cellar, a broken salt crust, all could ruin weeks of work. Rats, insects, and mold claimed their share of the stores. Families guarded their food carefully, checking cellars, resealing jars, repairing pits. The battle against decay was ongoing, relentless. Yet, through patience and persistence, people endured. Each jar, each pit, each cellar, and each grain of salt represented victory over time, hunger, and uncertainty. And in those victories lay the foundation of human survival. When we think about food preservation in ancient times, it's easy to imagine simple survival. But in truth, these methods shaped not only daily meals, but also trade, festivals, and the rhythm of entire communities. The way food was stored influenced how people lived, how they traveled, and even how they celebrated together. For instance, imagine the role of festivals. In many ancient cultures, harvest festivals were not just about gratitude to the gods, or the earth. They were also about the relief of knowing food had been safely stored. After weeks of gathering, drying, salting, and packing, the village could finally rest. The granaries were full, the jars sealed, and the root cellars stocked. People danced, sang, and feasted, not because of abundance alone, but because preservation meant safety for the coming months. In the Middle East, stored dates and figs often formed the heart of festival meals. In Europe, salted meats and dried fruits were brought out for winter feasts. In Asia, preserved fish and pickled vegetables became central to communal gatherings. Preservation turned fleeting harvests into lasting traditions, linking daily labor to moments of joy. Beyond festivals, food storage allowed for travel and exploration. Traders and merchants could not have crossed deserts or sailed oceans without preserved food. Dried meat, hard bread, salted fish, and honey cakes provided sustenance on long journeys. Amphorae of oil or wine, jars of grain, and bundles of dried fruit traveled across continents, creating networks of exchange that spread not just goods, but cultures. Picture a caravan crossing the Silk Road. Camels move steadily across the desert, their backs loaded with jars and sacks. Inside the jars, salted fish, dried apricots, nuts, and fermented sauces. Merchants rest by a fire at night, opening their supplies, sharing preserved foods that taste of distant lands. Without these methods, the caravan could not survive the endless miles. Even armies relied on food preservation. A marching army needed steady supplies, and preservation made this possible. Roman soldiers carried dried grains, salted pork, and hard cheese in their packs. In medieval Europe, smoked meats and barrels of salted herring fed entire battalions. Victory often depended not just on weapons, but on who could keep their soldiers fed longest. As the old saying goes, an army marches on its stomach. But while armies and traders thought in terms of strategy, ordinary people continued their quiet work in cellars and kitchens. Each season brought its own tasks. After the grain harvest, families checked their jars and silos. Before winter, vegetables were buried in sand or hung in cool rooms. Hunters salted venison or smoked fish. Dairy farmers churned butter and pressed cheese. Even children helped, carrying baskets, turning fruits, or gathering herbs for drying. Food storage was not just work, it was education. Each generation learned from the one before how much salt to use, how to seal a jar, how to hang meat properly in smoke. These lessons were vital. A mistake could mean spoiled food, wasted effort, or hunger in winter. Thus, parents taught carefully, and children listened closely, knowing that their very survival depended on these quiet skills. In some cases, preservation even shaped social roles. In many villages, women oversaw cellars and pantries, ensuring that supplies were carefully managed. Men often handled the heavy labor of harvesting, smoking, or cutting ice. Blacksmiths crafted tools for digging pits or shaping jars, while potters provided the containers. Each person played a part, and together they created the chain of survival. If we step back, we can see how remarkable this system was. Without machines, electricity, or modern packaging, ancient people mastered time itself. They stretched the brief life of milk into cheese, the sweetness of fruit into dried raisins, the freshness of meat into salted stores. They made abundance last, and as we imagine these practices, we begin to see not only the survival, but also the storytelling potential A cellar door creaking open in the dead of winter, a family gathered around smoked meats, thankful for the taste of summer in January, a jar of honey cracked open to reveal fruit that still shines golden months after it was picked. These images remind us that preservation was both practical and poetic. It is also the right moment to pause and remind ourselves, just as ancient wisdom was passed down from one generation to the next, so too must knowledge today be shared and preserved. If you are enjoying this journey into the quiet, fascinating history of food storage, don't forget to like this story and subscribe for more. Just as food was stored for the future, your support stores these stories for the days to come. Now, let us return to the methods themselves. We cannot forget the role of fermentation, one of the most ancient and mysterious forms of preservation. Unlike salt or drying, fermentation transformed food into something entirely new. Milk became yogurt, cabbage became sauerkraut, grapes became wine, grain became beer. These foods lasted longer, carried richer flavors, and often became healthier or more digestible through the process. Imagine a clay jar filled with cabbage and salt, left in a cool corner. Days later, the cabbage begins to ferment, releasing sour, sharp flavors that protect it from decay. Or a jar of crushed grapes, bubbling as wild yeasts turn their sugars into wine. These transformations seemed magical to ancient people, yet they relied on them for both preservation and pleasure. Fermentation was unpredictable at times, but once mastered, it became part of tradition. Entire cuisines grew around these preserved foods, and many still exist today. Yogurt in Central Asia, kimchi in Korea, sauerkraut in Europe, beer and wine across continents, all born of the desire to make food last, and all rooted in the same ancient wisdom. Thus, in the great story of food storage, fermentation joined cellars, jars, ice pits, and salt as another tool in humanity's quiet struggle with time. Together, these methods formed the invisible foundation of daily life, ensuring that families endured, communities thrived, and civilizations grew strong. When we look at food preservation in the ancient world, it's important to realize that it wasn't only about survival. It was about culture, taste, and memory. Every method, whether storing grain in silos or fermenting vegetables in jars, carried a story that reflected the landscape, the people, and their way of life. Let us begin with the desert civilizations, where the environment itself shaped how food was preserved. In Egypt, the hot, dry climate made natural dehydration possible. Fish, fruits, and even grains could be laid out in the sun, covered lightly to keep insects away, and slowly dried into long-lasting forms. Dates shriveled into chewy sweetness, fish hardened into salty strips, and onions turned into light, durable bulbs that traveled well. In Mesopotamia, the people combined drying with salting. Along the rivers, fish were cleaned, salted, and hung to dry in the desert air. This combination preserved them for months, even years, making them a staple food in regions where fresh supplies were uncertain. Clay tablets even recorded rations of preserved fish for workers and soldiers. It was not just food, it was part of the administrative system. Now, let us travel north to the frozen regions, where preservation took a very different form. In colder lands, nature itself was the preserver. People buried meat beneath snow, or kept it in natural ice pits dug deep into the ground. Winter was a natural refrigerator, and families used it to their advantage. Whole animals could be stored frozen, providing food well into the leanest months. Imagine the silence of a northern forest. A hunter drags a deer carcass to a pit, lines it with snow and branches, and buries it deep. Months later, he returns, lifts the cover, and finds the meat still frozen, still safe. Nature's cold hand had guarded the meal. But preservation was never only about climate, it was about innovation. Across different cultures, people invented new ways to stretch time. Take, for example, the use of ash and clay. In some ancient communities, fruits like apples or pears were coated with ash or stored in earthen layers, slowing decay. The ash kept pests away, while the cool earth prevented spoiling. Similarly, eggs were preserved in mixtures of clay, lime, and salt. This method, still practiced in some parts of Asia, could keep eggs edible for months. Imagine the relief of a family in winter, still able to eat eggs late in summer, thanks to this quiet wisdom. Even more fascinating is the way preservation linked to medicine and belief. In Greece and Rome, salt and honey were not just practical preservatives, they were seen as purifying, almost sacred. Honey, in particular, was believed to carry life-giving powers. Bodies were sometimes embalmed with honey. Fruits and nuts were stored in it for special occasions. To eat honey-preserved food was to taste not only sweetness, but also a connection to the divine. We also find evidence of herbs and spices used in preservation. Garlic, mustard seeds, and cloves were added to oils or pickling solutions, not only for flavor, but for their natural antibacterial properties. Ancient people may not have spoken of microbes, but they observed that certain herbs kept food fresh longer. Their kitchens were laboratories, their recipes experiments in survival. Now, let us pause and think of the emotional side. Imagine a mother in a small village, carefully hanging herbs in her kitchen to dry, salting fish in a wooden tub, sealing jars with wax. She is not just preserving food, she is preserving the comfort of her children, the certainty of meals in the cold months ahead. Each jar is a promise, each salted piece a safeguard against hunger. This emotional connection shows us why food preservation was also deeply tied to rituals and storytelling. Families told stories while storing food. Songs were sung during harvest and preservation work. Myths even grew around certain foods, like how the gods gave salt to humanity, or how wine was discovered by accident when grapes fermented in a forgotten jar. Preservation was not just about utility, it was woven into identity. Trade, too, expanded because of preserved foods. Dried figs from the Mediterranean reached northern lands. Salted fish traveled across seas. Pickled vegetables moved along caravans. Each preserved food carried not only taste, but culture, carrying a little piece of one world into another. Picture a Roman ship unloading barrels of salted herring in a busy port. Merchants shout, coins change hands, and the smell of the sea clings to the air. The fish inside will travel inland, feeding farmers and soldiers hundreds of miles from the ocean. Without preservation, this trade would vanish, and entire economies would shrink. Preservation also created luxury items. In some regions, preserved fruits dipped in honey became delicacies served at royal banquets. Wine and cheese, both products of fermentation, grew into symbols of sophistication. What began as survival tools became signs of status. A jar of spiced preserved fruits on a noble's table was more than food. It was wealth, it was prestige. The brilliance of these methods is clear. People turned necessity into tradition, and tradition into culture. What began as a way to survive winter or famine became a way to celebrate, to trade, and to define identity. And as we reflect on this, it is the right moment to remind ourselves, just as ancient families preserved their food for the future, you can help preserve these stories for others. If you are enjoying this journey, don't forget to like this story and subscribe. Your support keeps the history alive. Returning to the story, one cannot forget the role of community cellars. In medieval Europe, some towns built shared underground storage. These large, cool spaces held barrels of beer, wine, grain, and salted meat. They were guarded and maintained by the community, ensuring that food supplies were steady and fair. In times of famine, these stores became lifelines. In Asia, large clay jars lined communal granaries, and each family contributed a portion of their harvest. These collective efforts protected against disaster, showing that preservation was not only individual, but also social. Survival depended on trust, cooperation, and careful management. Thus, when we think of ancient food storage, we must imagine not just tools and techniques, but the spirit of cooperation that made them work. A single family might struggle, but a community united around preservation could endure even the harshest winters or the longest journeys. The story of ancient food storage is, in many ways, the story of patience. Preservation was never immediate. It required waiting, trusting, and tending. People accepted that food needed time to dry, ferment, salt, or age. In this sense, preservation reflected a philosophy of life itself: respect for time, faith in the future, and confidence in the work of one's hands. Let us explore the granary, one of humanity's earliest and most powerful inventions. Long before cities rose, early farmers realized that storing surplus grain meant survival during droughts or harsh winters. From mud brick silos in Mesopotamia to stone-lined pits in Europe, granaries became symbols of security. Grain was poured in, sealed from pests, and carefully guarded. Imagine a family in ancient Egypt carrying baskets of wheat to a communal silo. The father pours the golden grains into the bin, while the children laugh and help smooth the pile. The mother ties a rope across the entrance, sealing it with clay. Weeks later, when hunger presses, the family returns, breaking the seal and scooping out grain as fresh as the day it was harvested. These stores were so valuable that they became the foundation of power. Kings and rulers who controlled granaries controlled the people. Taxes were often collected in grain, and armies were fed by these reserves. Grain storage was not just about food, it was about politics, wealth, and control. In fact, some historians argue that organized grain storage gave rise to the earliest states. But storing grain was not simple. Moisture could rot it, pests could eat it, and heat could spoil it. Ancient farmers learned to line silos with clay, to keep them cool, and to check them often. Sometimes, herbs like mint or garlic were placed nearby, as people believed their scents drove away insects. It was a constant struggle between human ingenuity and nature's persistence. Grain was not the only staple stored carefully. Legumes, beans, lentils, and peas were dried and stored in jars. These provided vital protein when meat was scarce. Families sorted them carefully, discarding bad seeds, drying them fully, and sealing them tightly. When boiled months later, they became hearty meals that sustained life. Meanwhile, fruits demanded more delicate care. Grapes were dried into raisins, apricots into leathery sheets, apples into thin slices. These were sweet treasures in the dark months, especially for children. Honey sometimes coated the dried fruits, giving them extra protection and a luxurious taste. Imagine a winter evening in an ancient home, a father opening a jar of raisins, handing them to his children, their eyes lighting up at the rare sweetness. Another fascinating practice was the storage of nuts and seeds. Almonds, walnuts, sesame, and flax seeds lasted well if kept dry. These were not only foods, but sources of oil, ground into paste or pressed into liquid. Ancient jars of oil, carefully sealed, have been found thousands of years old, still intact. Oil was food, fuel, and medicine, so its preservation was a matter of survival. But beyond the practical, let us think of the spiritual meaning. In many traditions, storing food was linked to the idea of storing blessings. Just as families preserved grain for winter, they believed their prayers and good deeds were stored by the gods for the future. Food was life, and preserving it was an act of gratitude, of faith that tomorrow was worth preparing for. This is why rituals surrounded storage. Some people placed charms in cellars, others whispered prayers while sealing jars. In Europe, families sometimes made the sign of the cross over granaries. In Asia, incense was burned before filling jars. Across the world, preservation was not only physical, but spiritual. And yet, with all these practices, the risk of famine always lingered. A single bad season, a mistake in preservation, or an invasion by pests could wipe out supplies. That is why storage was never taken lightly. Families checked jars daily, granaries weekly, and cellars constantly. The rhythm of life itself followed the rhythm of preservation. Trade expanded this safety net. If one region suffered, preserved foods from another could fill the gap. Salted fish from coastal towns reached inland farmers. Dried fruits from orchards traveled to cities. Oil from groves was poured into amphorae and shipped across seas. The preserved food was mobile wealth, able to move where it was needed most. Picture a bustling marketplace in ancient Rome. Traders unload carts filled with amphorae of oil, sacks of grain, and jars of salted olives. The air is filled with the sound of bargaining, the smell of dried herbs, and the clink of coins. Every item there owes its presence to preservation. Without it, the market would collapse and the city would starve. In a quieter scene, a medieval farmer checks his cellar. Hanging from beams are strings of onions and garlic. In one corner, barrels of salted pork rest in brine. Along the walls, jars of dried beans and peas line wooden shelves. The air is cool and earthy, carrying the scent of smoke and salt. To him, this is wealth more precious than gold, for it is the key to survival. And here, we can pause once again to connect the wisdom of the past with the present. Just as these ancient families carefully stored food for the future, we too must store knowledge and history for those who come after us. If you are finding these stories meaningful, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. By doing so, you are helping preserve these tales, just as people once preserved their food. Returning to our journey, let us not forget dairy preservation. Milk spoiled quickly, but ancient people found ways to transform it into butter, yogurt, and cheese. Butter, when salted, lasted longer, Yogurt stayed edible for weeks. Cheese, depending on how it was pressed and aged, could last months or even years. These foods became staples in places where fresh milk could never last. Cheese, especially, carried culture. Each region developed its own methods: soft cheeses, hard cheeses, spiced cheeses. A wheel of cheese stored in a cool cellar represented patience and skill. It was more than food. It was craftsmanship, preserved in edible form. So, whether it was grain sealed in silos, fruits dried in the sun, meats salted and smoked, or milk turned to cheese, ancient people showed remarkable creativity. They fought against decay with tools as simple as sun, salt, ice, clay, and patience. And through these efforts, civilizations not only survived, but flourished. Trade routes expanded, cities grew, and cultures thrived, all resting on the quiet miracle of food storage. In the story of human survival, food storage stands as one of the greatest unsung achievements. Fire, the wheel, and writing often steal the spotlight. But without the ability to preserve food, civilizations would never have grown large or stable. Storing food was the silent partner of progress, the hidden strength behind empires and communities alike. One of the most fascinating aspects of food preservation is the seasonal rhythm it created. Life in ancient times was not constant, but moved in cycles. Spring brought planting and the early gathering of herbs. Summer filled baskets with fruits and vegetables. Autumn was the season of harvest, when fields yielded grain and orchards overflowed. Winter was a time of waiting, living on what had been preserved. Families worked tirelessly in late summer and autumn to prepare for the cold months ahead. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or brine. Fruits were laid out to dry on rooftops. Meat was hung in smokehouses, while milk was churned into butter and pressed into cheese. The rhythm of the seasons dictated the rhythm of labor, and preservation was at its heart. Imagine a medieval village in early autumn. The sun sets slowly, casting a golden glow on busy courtyards. Women stir large cauldrons of boiling brine, lowering strips of meat into the steaming liquid. Men gather wood for smoking huts, while children spread sliced apples onto wicker trays. The air is filled with scents: salt, smoke, drying fruit. These are not just smells of labor, they are smells of security, of hope against the coming frost. And yet, food storage was not only about the individual household, it was about community survival. In some villages, granaries were built in central locations, guarded by watchmen. In times of hardship, these reserves were rationed, ensuring no family starved. Shared responsibility made the difference between survival and despair. Trade hubs magnified this pattern. In places like Constantinople or Baghdad, massive storehouses held grains, spices, dried fish, and olive oil. Merchants could buy and sell, transporting preserved foods to distant lands. The stability of these markets depended on the steady flow of preserved supplies. Without it, caravans would have nothing to carry, ships would have no cargo, and trade routes would collapse. Consider the role of salt, often called white gold. Salt was not merely a seasoning, it was a lifeline. It preserved meat and fish, extended the life of cheese, and added safety to food supplies. Entire economies rose around salt mines and salt routes. Wars were fought over salt, taxes levied upon it, and fortunes made through its trade. To preserve food was to preserve power. Salted fish, in particular, became a global commodity. From the Mediterranean to northern Europe, barrels of herring and cod were shipped across seas, feeding sailors, armies, and cities alike. A single barrel of salted fish could feed dozens of people for weeks. In many ways, these barrels were more valuable than coin, for they carried life itself. Meanwhile, in colder regions, the ice pit remained a quiet marvel, digging deep into the earth, lining pits with straw or wood, and filling them with blocks of ice cut from frozen rivers. This was an ancient form of refrigeration. Families would store perishable goods there, checking the pits through the summer months. It required planning, strength, and discipline, but the reward was fresh food long after the ice had melted on the surface. Picture a farmer in Scandinavia, his breath clouding the winter air, cutting thick slabs of ice from a frozen lake. He drags them back on a sled, lowering them carefully into a deep pit. Layer by layer, he stacks the ice, covering it with straw. Months later, his family pulls butter, milk, and even fresh vegetables from the cool pit, grateful for the foresight. But ice was not available everywhere. In warmer climates, people turned instead to cellars. Dug beneath houses or barns, these underground chambers stayed cool and dark. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes thrived in their damp soil beds. Barrels of cider and wine lined the walls. Shelves held jars of pickled cucumbers, beans, and fruits sealed in wax. The cellar was both pantry and treasure chest, holding the key to survival in its shadowed silence. Inside these spaces, preservation was also about discipline. Families counted supplies carefully, deciding how much to eat each day. To eat too freely meant hunger later. To eat too sparingly meant weakness in the present. Thus, cellars became places of decision-making, where families balanced their immediate desires against future needs. Beyond the practical, preserved foods often shaped tradition and taste. Many dishes that we now consider cultural staples began as preserved foods. Think of sauerkraut in Germany, kimchi in Korea, or pickled vegetables across the Middle East. These were not invented for flavor alone, but as ways to extend food. Over time, their flavors became beloved, turning necessity into heritage. Fermented beverages tell a similar story. Beer, wine, and mead all arose as methods of preserving grains, fruits, and honey. What began as storage turned into ritual, celebration, and even religion. A jar of fermenting grapes was not just about preservation, it was about community, story, and identity. And here, let us pause again, for just as ancient people took care to preserve their food for the future, you too can help preserve these histories. If you are enjoying this quiet journey through the forgotten wisdom of the past, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. In doing so, you keep these tales alive, ensuring they are not lost to time. Returning to the story, it is remarkable how simple tools supported such profound survival. Clay jars sealed with wax, barrels bound with iron hoops, pits lined with straw. None of these were complex machines, yet they held entire civilizations together. With patience, wisdom, and cooperation, humanity managed to tame decay and turn fragile harvests into lasting nourishment. Even the humblest method, such as hanging onions in cool air or wrapping cheese in cloth, had a profound effect. These simple acts were repeated countless times across generations, each one an unbroken chain of survival. Thus, as we walk deeper into this history, we realize that food preservation was not only a skill, but an art of living. It required observation, creativity, and above all, respect for nature's rhythms. And because of this art, humanity endured, thrived, and built the foundations of the world we know today. The quiet genius of ancient food storage lies in its simplicity. What we might see as basic or even primitive today was, in truth, the product of centuries of careful observation, trial, and error. Families, villages, and entire kingdoms depended on these practices, and their success determined whether people would feast, survive, or starve. One of the most striking examples of this ingenuity is the smokehouse. Long before refrigerators, smoke was harnessed not just for flavor, but for protection. The smoke from burning wood carried natural compounds that slowed decay and deterred pests. Meats hung in smokehouses absorbed these compounds, turning fresh cuts into long-lasting supplies. Picture a wooden smokehouse on the edge of a medieval village. Inside, racks of pork, venison, and fish hang from beams. A fire smolders below, sending slow waves of smoke upward. The air inside is thick, aromatic, and dark. Outside, children play while their parents check the fire, making sure it burns low and steady. Days later, the meat emerges darkened, firm, and safe to store for months. Different woods gave different flavors: oak, hickory, apple, or cherry, adding regional variety to smoked foods. What began as a necessity slowly shaped culinary traditions, creating tastes that defined entire cultures. Even today, smoked meats and fish carry the echo of these ancient practices. But smoking was not the only form of preservation that combined practicality with taste. The art of pickling also deserves attention. By immersing vegetables, fruits, and even meats in brine or vinegar, people created an acidic environment that discouraged spoilage. Pickles were bright, sharp, and tangy, bringing life to meals in the dull winter months. Imagine a kitchen filled with clay jars. Cucumbers float in brine with garlic and dill. Carrots, beans, and cabbage soak in vinegar seasoned with herbs. The jars are sealed with wax, stacked carefully on shelves, waiting for months when fresh produce would be nothing but a memory. When opened, the vegetables burst with flavor, a small taste of summer in the heart of winter. Pickling was not just a household skill, but an economic force. Pickled foods traveled well, stayed edible for long journeys, and became valuable trade goods. Soldiers carried pickled vegetables on campaigns. Merchants packed them into caravans. Sailors relied on them to ward off scurvy. Thus, pickles, humble as they may seem, played a quiet but powerful role in shaping history. Alongside smoking and pickling stood the method of drying. Drying was perhaps the oldest and most universal form of preservation, practiced on every continent. Grains, fruits, herbs, and even meats could be dried by the sun, the wind, or by fire. Once dry, food became lighter, easier to transport, and resistant to decay. Think of herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters of a medieval cottage. Their green leaves slowly curl and fade, their fragrance filling the room. Weeks later, they crumble into powders that can be stored in jars, ready to season stews or teas in the long winter ahead. Drying was simple, but it turned fragile harvests into stores that could outlast time itself. Now let us not forget the role of clay jars and amphorae, silent guardians of preserved food. Amphorae, with their narrow necks and pointed bases, were perfect for storing wine, oil, grains, and salted fish. Their design minimized spoilage, kept out pests, and allowed easy transport. Picture a ship rocking gently on the Mediterranean Sea, its hold packed with rows of amphorae. Inside them, golden olive oil, dried figs, and salted mackerel. The ship carries not just food, but culture, sending flavors of one land into the kitchens of another. Without amphorae, the trade networks of the ancient world would have been impossible. The amphora was more than a container. It was a bridge between civilizations. Greek oil reached Egypt, Roman wine reached Gaul, and preserved fish reached markets across Europe and Asia. The jars themselves, stamped with symbols of origin, became a language of commerce. To see a familiar mark on an amphora was to trust its contents, to believe in the unseen hands that had prepared it. Meanwhile, beneath the earth, root cellars remained vital. These underground storage spaces were natural refrigerators. Their cool, damp air preserved root vegetables, fruits, and even barrels of drink. Families often checked them carefully, rearranging produce, removing anything that spoiled, and keeping the air flowing. Picture a root cellar in the heart of winter. The ground above is frozen, the fields barren, but below the surface lies abundance. Carrots lie buried in sand, still crisp. Apples rest in straw, their skins cool and smooth. Potatoes pile high in baskets. Barrels of cider line the walls. The family above may live in snow and ice, but the cellar below holds the memory of autumn's plenty. These storage practices were not only practical, they were ritualized knowledge, passed from one generation to the next. A child who learned how to salt fish or hang onions properly carried that wisdom into adulthood, ensuring continuity. Mistakes were costly, so accuracy mattered. And over time, these practices became tradition, woven into the very identity of families and communities. In many ways, food storage shaped trust and relationships. Neighbors often shared preserved foods, knowing that one year's abundance might be balanced by another's need. Festivals featured preserved goods, shared among families, strengthening bonds. In monasteries, preserved foods sustained monks through fasting and prayer. In castles, they fed nobles and soldiers alike. Preservation connected everyone, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest king. And so, as we reflect on these practices, we see how food preservation was not only survival, but also civilization itself. Without it, there could be no armies marching, no ships sailing, no cities rising. The humble smokehouse, the clay jar, the root cellar, these were the engines of history, turning perishable harvests into the power of endurance. Before we move further, let us take a moment to honor the wisdom of those who came before us. If you are enjoying this journey, if these quiet stories of food and survival speak to you, then please remember to like this story and subscribe. Just as food was preserved to sustain families, your support preserves these tales for the future. Returning once more, let us consider the psychological comfort of stored food. Imagine the relief of a family knowing their cellar was full. Each jar, each barrel, was a shield against uncertainty. Preservation turned fear into confidence, hunger into security, and scarcity into abundance. To open a jar of honey-preserved fruit in the dead of winter was not only nourishment, it was hope itself. Thus, we see that food preservation was more than a craft. It was the quiet architecture of survival, the hidden foundation of history. And as we continue, we will uncover even more ways in which humanity bent nature to its will, using time, patience, and creativity to endure. As we explore the story of ancient food preservation, it becomes clear that survival was only the beginning. The methods people developed to keep food edible shaped economies, social structures, culinary traditions, and even cultural identity. Preservation was, in many ways, the invisible backbone of civilization. Consider the ingenuity of ice storage in ancient Persia. In the desert heat, keeping perishable foods safe seemed nearly impossible. Yet, Persians built massive yakhchals, or ancient ice houses, that used insulation, shade, and clever architecture to store ice and food for months. These conical structures, sometimes reaching over 30 feet high, kept ice harvested in winter intact through the scorching summer months. Imagine the labor involved: men cutting blocks of ice from mountain streams, transporting them down to the desert, and carefully stacking them inside a yakhchal. Straw and sand insulated the ice, while thick walls kept heat out. Inside, dairy, meat, and fruits remained cool, allowing families and communities to enjoy fresh foods even in the harshest climates. It was engineering, ingenuity, and survival combined into a single masterpiece. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, root cellars provided a natural solution to a different climate. Dug into hillsides or beneath cottages, these cool, damp chambers preserved vegetables like carrots, turnips, onions, and potatoes for months. Families checked them regularly, ensuring that the produce remained firm and edible. Picture a late autumn evening. The frost is settling over the fields. A farmer descends the steps of the cellar, candle in hand, and carefully inspects each crate of vegetables. The air smells earthy and damp, a quiet reassurance that the family will have food through the long winter. In this underground chamber, survival is tangible, measured in the weight of potatoes or the crispness of stored apples. Beyond cellars and ice pits, salt played a central role worldwide. Salted meat and fish were staples for armies, travelers, and coastal communities. Entire trades and economies grew around salt production. The Romans taxed salt, Vikings used it for preservation and barter, and in Asia, salted fish traveled hundreds of miles along river and sea routes. Salt was more than a mineral, it was life itself. Imagine a medieval port town. Workers fill barrels with salt, pressing fish inside, layer by layer. Merchants inspect the barrels, ensuring the fish is fully covered. These barrels will travel across lands and seas, feeding soldiers, sailors, and townsfolk alike. Without preservation, such trade would have been impossible, and entire civilizations might have struggled to survive. Another key method was drying. From the sun-drenched deserts of the Middle East to the wind-swept plains of Europe, people relied on the natural environment to remove moisture from fruits, grains, and meats. Sun-dried fruits, jerky, and dried herbs could last months or even years. Drying was simple, yet its effects were profound. It made food portable, lightweight, and long-lasting. Imagine laying out sliced figs or strips of meat on woven mats under the hot sun. Children run through the courtyard, scattering a few stray seeds, while elders carefully turn the pieces for even drying. By evening, the air is filled with a mix of sweet, savory, and earthy aromas. By the next week, the fruits and meats are ready to be stored in jars or sacks, destined to sustain families through months of scarcity. Preservation also gave rise to fermentation, one of the most transformative methods of extending food life. Milk turned into cheese or yogurt. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Grapes turned into wine. Grain became beer. Fermentation was more than survival. It was culture. It created flavors, textures, and beverages that defined societies. Imagine a small village in ancient Europe. Jars of cabbage ferment slowly in a corner, their sharp, tangy aroma filling the air. A family gathers at mealtime, enjoying the preserved food alongside fresh bread and cheese. In the process, they are participating in a tradition that has lasted for generations. Fermentation turns preservation into identity, blending necessity with taste. At the same time, storage often reflected community cooperation. Granaries, communal cellars, and shared ice pits required planning and collective effort. In medieval Europe, town granaries were guarded and maintained to ensure that all residents had access to food in times of shortage. In Asia, families contributed portions of their harvest to communal jars or warehouses. Preservation was as social as it was practical. Even the humble jar played a critical role. Clay jars, amphorae, and ceramic vessels sealed with wax or clay were versatile, durable, and transportable. They held grains, liquids, and preserved foods, enabling both households and merchants to store and move sustenance across vast distances. These vessels were the unsung heroes of trade, enabling economies to thrive in ways that raw, perishable foods never could. The act of preserving food also carried a psychological dimension. A well-stocked cellar or a stack of salted meat provided security, reducing anxiety about famine, harsh winters, or failed harvests. To ancient people, the sight of neatly stacked jars or barrels meant stability, safety, and continuity. Preservation was not just physical, it was emotional. And as we pause here, it is the perfect moment to remind viewers, just as ancient families safeguarded their food, we too can safeguard stories. If you are enjoying this exploration of history, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Every click helps keep these tales alive, connecting past wisdom with present curiosity. Returning to the methods themselves, we see the interplay between environment and ingenuity. Deserts demanded yakhchals and drying. Cold climates demanded ice pits and cellars. Coastal regions demanded salting and smoking. And everywhere, fermentation, jars, and careful handling were universal solutions. People everywhere solved the same basic problem: how to make food last, using the resources at hand. It's also worth noting that these preservation methods shaped culinary identity. Foods that were preserved developed flavors and textures that people came to love. Pickled vegetables, smoked meats, and fermented drinks became integral to regional cuisines. Preservation turned survival techniques into defining cultural elements. Thus, the story of ancient food storage is the story of humanity's relationship with nature, with time, and with each other. It is about patience, foresight, creativity, and community. It reminds us that even the simplest methods, salt, smoke, sun, and clay, can sustain life, culture, and civilization itself. When we examine ancient food storage, we see that necessity often sparked invention. The methods developed to preserve grains, fruits, vegetables, meats, and liquids were not only practical, but also ingenious, reflecting centuries of observation, experimentation, and cultural refinement. These practices shaped everyday life, trade, and even social hierarchies. Take, for example, Honey, a naturally long-lasting preservative. In ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, honey was more than a sweet treat. Its natural antibacterial properties made it ideal for storing fruits, nuts, and even meat. Food dipped in honey could last for months, and in some cases, millennia. Archaeologists have discovered honey in Egyptian tombs still perfectly preserved, a testament to its remarkable power. Picture a mother in a Mediterranean village, coating figs or dates in honey. She seals them in clay jars, ready to feed her family through the long summer heat or the winter months ahead. Honey's sweetness was both practical and symbolic, representing sustenance, care, and longevity. Alongside honey, smoking remained essential. The smokehouse transformed perishable meats into long-lasting supplies, but it also added flavor, turning necessity into culinary tradition. Imagine hanging venison or fish above a slow-burning fire. Days pass as the smoke curls and thickens, infusing the meat with aroma while warding off decay. Smoked meats became portable, allowing traders, soldiers, and explorers to carry protein across vast distances. Another critical preservation method was salting. Salt draws moisture out of food, inhibiting the growth of bacteria. In coastal regions, fish were cleaned, salted, and packed into barrels. Salted meats sustained armies and sailors. Salt itself became a valuable commodity, traded, taxed, and sometimes even used as currency. The phrase, worth one S salt, originates from this essential mineral S role in survival. We must also consider the power of fermentation. Milk turned into cheese and yogurt, cabbage into sauerkraut, grapes into wine, and grains into beer. Fermentation did more than preserve food. It enhanced nutrition and created new flavors. Villagers knew which jars of fermenting vegetables could be trusted and which might spoil. This knowledge was passed down through generations, ensuring continuity and safety. Imagine a small village in medieval Europe. Jars of fermenting cabbage line a dark corner. Barrels of wine bubble gently. Cheese wheels rest on shelves. Families gather to share meals, knowing that the preserved food they eat today carries the labor and wisdom of months past. Preservation also influenced rituals and festivals. Harvest celebrations were not only about gathering crops, but also about ensuring they could be stored properly. In some cultures, special ceremonies accompanied the sealing of jars or the brining of meats. Songs were sung while hanging herbs to dry, or turning barrels of fermenting liquids. Preservation was practical, yes, but it was also cultural, embedding survival into the fabric of daily life. Trade networks flourished because of preservation. Salted fish from coastal towns reached inland villages. Dried fruits from orchards were transported to markets hundreds of miles away. Oil, wine, and grains crossed seas in amphorae, reaching distant civilizations. Preserved food was portable wealth, enabling commerce and connecting communities across continents. Picture a bustling ancient port. Ships are loaded with barrels, sacks, and jars. Merchants shout, sailors haul amphorae, and the air is thick with the scent of herbs, salt, and dried grains. Every preserved item is a lifeline, feeding not just the city, but economies and armies across the region. Without preservation, trade and civilization would have been far more limited. Even root cellars played a remarkable role in sustaining communities. Dug beneath homes, barns, or hillsides, they offered cool, dark storage, for vegetables, fruits, and beverages. The cellar's stable temperature slowed spoilage, allowing families to survive harsh winters. Imagine opening a cellar door in the dead of winter to reveal rows of carrots, turnips, and potatoes, along with barrels of cider and wine. The sight of this stored abundance was a tangible reassurance. In warmer climates, ice pits were equally vital. Ancient Persians used yakhchals to preserve ice and cool foods during scorching summers. Blocks of ice, harvested from mountains, were stored in conical pits insulated with straw and thick walls. Inside, dairy, meat, and fruits stayed fresh for months. It was an extraordinary adaptation, turning a natural resource into a tool of survival. Communal preservation also reflected social cohesion. Town granaries and shared cellars ensured equitable access to food in times of scarcity. Families contributed to communal stores, and those stores became lifelines during famine. Preservation was not only personal, but social, reinforcing trust and mutual dependence. And yet, preservation was more than physical. It carried psychological importance. A well-stocked cellar, jar, or barrel represented security and stability. Families knew they could withstand the harshest seasons. Preservation was hope in tangible form, a hedge against hunger, and a promise of continuity. This interplay of practicality, ingenuity, and culture created a legacy. Many foods we cherish today, pickles, cheeses, fermented beverages, dried fruits, and smoked meats, originated from preservation practices. What began as necessity became culinary tradition, a gift from the past. Here, we pause to honor these quiet achievements. If you are following this journey through the ancient art of food storage, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Your support preserves these tales, just as ancient people preserved their food for the future. Returning to methods, the simplicity of jars, amphorae, and barrels cannot be overstated. They allowed families to organize their stores, protect food from pests, and transport goods over long distances. Their designs, narrow necks, durable clay, secure seals, were the product of centuries of refinement. Even today, they inspire modern packaging and storage solutions. Lastly, consider how preservation shaped culinary creativity. Pickling, smoking, drying, and fermenting were not merely survival techniques. They became defining elements of regional cuisines. A dish of sauerkraut or kimchi, a wheel of aged cheese, a slice of dried fruit. These flavors tell a story of human ingenuity, patience, and culture. Through these combined methods, smoking, salting, fermenting, drying, cellaring, ice storage, ancient peoples were able to turn fleeting harvests into long-term sustenance. They transformed perishable food into enduring wealth, safety, and identity. And through their efforts, civilizations thrived, economies expanded, and cultures endured. As we continue exploring ancient food storage, it becomes evident that preservation was not merely a practical necessity. It was an art form, a social practice, and a technological achievement. Every jar sealed, every root buried, and every salted fish represented a careful negotiation with time and nature. One of the most fascinating methods was root vegetable storage. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and later potatoes were kept in cool, damp cellars, often buried in sand or straw. This slowed moisture loss and prevented spoilage. Families would check the vegetables regularly, removing any that began to rot. The root cellar became a quiet sanctuary of sustenance, a hidden store of life beneath the frozen ground. Imagine a family in northern Europe during winter. Snow blankets the fields outside. The wind howls through bare trees. And yet, below the house, vegetables lie safe. Each day, the family opens the cellar door to retrieve food for meals, comforted by the knowledge that their harvest has endured. The root cellar is both pantry and sanctuary, a silent provider through months of scarcity. Another essential technique was drying and sun preservation. Sun drying allowed fruits, grains, and even meat to last far beyond their natural season. Figs, apricots, grapes, and fish were laid on mats or hung from beams, their moisture evaporating in the warm sun. Once fully dried, these foods could be stored in jars or sacks for months, providing nutrition when fresh options were unavailable. In Mediterranean climates, drying also became a cultural practice. Herbs like oregano, thyme, and mint were hung in kitchens not only for flavor, but for their preservative qualities. Drying herbs ensured that meals could be seasoned throughout the year, and families often relied on these aromatic plants to maintain both flavor and health. Preservation also required chemical ingenuity, especially in salting and pickling. Salted meats and fish could last for months, while vegetables pickled in brine or vinegar maintained both flavor and edibility. In many regions, these methods were adapted to local conditions. Coastal communities relied on salt from the sea. Inland villages fermented vegetables in clay jars. Both methods turned necessity into culinary identity. Picture a coastal fishing village. Workers gut and clean fish, layering them with salt in wooden barrels. These barrels will be transported inland or kept for winter consumption. The process is repetitive, methodical, and vital. Without it, the community would face hunger and spoilage. But with it, they create not only sustenance, but tradable goods. Ice and cold storage also played a role in more temperate and arid regions. In Persia, the yakhchal allowed communities to store ice collected during winter and preserve perishable foods in the hot summer months. Ingeniously designed, these conical structures insulated ice with thick walls and straw, keeping temperatures low for months. Inside, fruits, dairy, and meats remained fresh, demonstrating a remarkable understanding of climate and engineering. Even fermentation, often considered a culinary choice today, was primarily about preservation. Cheese, yogurt, sauerkraut, and wine allowed nutrients to be stored safely over time. The process added flavor, enhanced digestibility, and in some cases, increased the shelf life far beyond the original food item. Fermentation transformed basic survival strategies into enduring culinary traditions. We also see the importance of communal storage in ancient societies. Granaries, town cellars, and shared storage pits allowed communities to withstand famine, drought, or invasion. Families contributed portions of their harvest, and in return, had access to the collective store in times of need. Preservation became a social contract, reinforcing trust and mutual dependence. Imagine a medieval town granary. Villagers line up with sacks of grain. A town official weighs and stores the grain carefully. Months later, during a harsh winter or poor harvest, families return to the granary for their share. The system ensures survival, fairness, and community cohesion. Preservation here is not only technical, but also political and social. Jars and amphorae were critical tools in both household and trade. Their design minimized exposure to air and pests, allowing perishable foods and liquids to travel great distances. Olive oil, wine, salted fish, dried fruits, all moved across continents in these simple vessels. Without them, trade networks that shaped civilizations would have been impossible. Even simple tools like wooden barrels, wax seals, and clay lids played crucial roles. Their careful use prevented contamination, allowed stacking for storage efficiency, and maintained the integrity of preserved foods. Ancient families, merchants, and sailors all relied on these seemingly modest inventions to safeguard sustenance and wealth. Preservation also influenced dietary habits and social structure. Regions with effective storage methods could support larger populations, armies, and urban centers. Trade in preserved foods created economic opportunity, while scarcity dictated migration, conquest, or innovation. The ability to store and move food shaped power, culture, and survival on a global scale. Furthermore, food preservation carried emotional and psychological significance. Knowing that food was safely stored offered security, peace of mind, and resilience. The sight of neatly stacked jars, barrels, and baskets reassured families that they could endure the long winter, famine, or travel. Preservation transformed uncertainty into confidence and survival into a daily routine of care and planning. Finally, these methods left a lasting legacy. Many foods we enjoy today, pickled vegetables, fermented beverages, cheeses, dried fruits, smoked meats, originate from these ancient techniques. What began as necessity evolved into cultural identity, culinary tradition, and even art. Preservation was at once survival, commerce, culture, and creativity. And once again, as we reflect on these achievements, it is important to honor them. If you are enjoying this journey through the hidden history of food storage, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Just as ancient communities preserve their food for the future, your support helps preserve these tales for generations to come. Through cellars, jars, ice pits, salt, drying, smoking, and fermentation, humanity learned to master time and nature, creating abundance from scarcity and security from uncertainty. The story of food preservation is, in essence, the story of civilization itself. As we journey further into the world of ancient food storage, one fact becomes increasingly clear. The techniques used were as varied as the landscapes, climates, and cultures that produced them. From frigid northern forests to sun-scorched deserts, humans devised ingenious methods to ensure that food survived the tests of time and environment. One of the earliest and most universal methods was grain storage. Grain was the foundation of life, and its preservation meant survival. Early civilizations constructed granaries, mud brick silos, stone pits, or raised wooden bins to protect grain from moisture, pests, and theft. Grain was meticulously poured, leveled, and sometimes sealed with clay. Families, villages, and even entire kingdoms depended on these granaries. Imagine a family in ancient Mesopotamia harvesting wheat. The golden stalks are bundled, threshed, and finally poured into a communal silo. Children help smooth the surface, while elders seal cracks with clay. Later, when food is scarce, this stored wheat sustains the family, preventing famine. Granaries were not merely storage. They were security, economy, and political power all in one. Salted and smoked meats were another cornerstone of preservation. Salting drew moisture from food, inhibiting bacterial growth, while smoking added both flavor and protection. Coastal communities relied heavily on these methods. Fish, especially, was preserved in barrels of salt or hung above fires to smoke. These foods could last months, providing nutrition and tradable goods. Picture a medieval fisherman's hut on the North Sea coast. Barrels of salted herring line the walls. Fish hang above a low-burning fire, slowly absorbing smoke. The air is rich with the scents of salt and wood. These preserved fish are both sustenance and currency, feeding the village and supporting long trading voyages. Another fascinating practice was dairy preservation. Milk was transformed into butter, cheese, or yogurt. Butter, salted and stored in cool cellars, lasted for months. Cheese, when pressed and aged, became a durable staple that could be consumed over extended periods. Yogurt provided nutrients while fermenting in clay pots. Dairy preservation ensured protein remained available even in the absence of fresh milk. In warmer regions, ice storage and yakhchals were marvels of engineering. Ancient Persians harvested ice from mountain streams during winter and stored it in insulated conical pits. Inside these yakhchals, fruits, meats, and dairy stayed cool despite scorching summer heat. The foresight and labor involved were extraordinary, demonstrating humanity's ingenuity in taming the environment. Drying was another crucial method, widely practiced across continents. Fruits, vegetables, and meats were laid on mats or hung in the sun and wind until moisture evaporated. This simple technique created portable, long-lasting foods. Imagine laying out strips of beef or slices of figs under the Mediterranean sun. Children run past, scattering seeds and helping turn the pieces for even drying. Once finished, these foods are ready for storage in jars or sacks, extending their shelf life considerably. Pickling and fermentation also played vital roles. Vegetables were pickled in brine or vinegar, milk fermented into yogurt and cheese, and grains brewed into beer. Fermentation not only preserved food, but enhanced its flavor and nutrition. Cabbage fermented into sauerkraut, grapes fermented into wine, and grains into beer. These were staples for both sustenance and cultural expression. Imagine a small European village kitchen. Jars of fermenting vegetables line the shelves. Cheese wheels rest on wooden racks. Barrels of beer and wine bubble quietly. Families gather at mealtimes, enjoying these preserved foods, benefiting from both their nutritional and cultural significance. Root cellars were critical in temperate and cold climates. Dug underground, these chambers offered stable, cool, and damp environments for storing vegetables, fruits, and even beverages like cider. Families regularly inspected the cellars, removing spoiled items and rearranging stores. The root cellar was not just a storage space. It was a symbol of foresight and survival, a hidden layer of abundance during harsh winters. Preservation was also central to trade and economy. Salted fish, dried fruits, grains, and wine traveled vast distances, feeding armies, merchants, and urban populations. Clay jars, amphorae, and barrels enabled safe transport and minimized spoilage. Trade routes thrived because food could survive the journey, connecting civilizations and fostering cultural exchange. Communal granaries and cellars further reflected the social dimension of preservation. In many towns, these stores ensured equitable access during famine or poor harvests. Families contributed portions of their harvest, and in return could rely on communal stores in times of scarcity. Preservation was thus not only a matter of individual survival, but also a social contract, reinforcing trust and mutual dependence. Even simple techniques, like hanging herbs to dry or coating fruits in honey, had profound impacts. These small acts ensured survival, enhanced flavor, and carried knowledge across generations. Skills were taught from parent to child, from village elder to apprentice, creating a continuity of wisdom essential for thriving communities. Food storage also had a psychological component. A well-stocked cellar or a jar full of preserved fruits symbolized security, stability, and hope. The sight of neatly arranged stores reassured families that they could endure months without fresh harvests. Preservation was a tangible expression of foresight and care, turning uncertainty into confidence. And as always, as we pause to consider these lessons from history, it is worth acknowledging their value today. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Just as ancient communities preserved their food, your support helps preserve these forgotten tales for future generations. Through smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, and careful storage, humanity learned to master nature's limitations. The ability to preserve food was not just survival, it shaped trade, culture, diet, and civilization itself. Each jar, barrel, or pit was a testament to ingenuity, patience, and resilience, ensuring life could continue against the odds. As we delve deeper into ancient food preservation, it becomes increasingly clear that these practices were not merely about survival. They were intricately tied to culture, economy, and social structure. The methods developed over centuries reflected observation, ingenuity, and adaptability. One key example is smoking meats and fish. Smoking was not only a means of preservation, but also an art form that enhanced flavor and extended shelf life. Communities near rivers, lakes, and coasts relied heavily on smoked fish. They built smokehouses where foods hung over slow-burning fires, absorbing aromatic compounds that kept spoilage at bay. Picture a northern European fishing village. Smoke rises from the huts. As fish hang on wooden racks, villagers monitor the fire, ensuring it burns evenly. The smell of smoke mingles with the sea breeze, signaling both nourishment and the promise of survival. These smoked foods provided protein long after the fishing season ended, and they became valuable trade commodities, reaching inland towns and markets. Another ancient technique, salting, was equally essential. Salt draws moisture out of food, preventing bacterial growth. It preserved meats, fish, and even vegetables. Salt production was often a major economic activity, with entire communities depending on its trade. Salt routes, taxes, and even conflicts revolved around this essential mineral, emphasizing its value not just for taste, but for survival. In addition to salt and smoke, fermentation played a critical role. Milk transformed into yogurt and cheese, cabbage into sauerkraut, grapes into wine, and grains into beer. Fermentation preserved nutrients and created flavors unique to each culture. Imagine a medieval kitchen, jars of fermenting vegetables lined up, barrels of beer bubbling gently. Families relied on these preserved foods for sustenance, taste, and even religious rituals. Drying was another universal preservation technique. Sun-dried fruits, vegetables, and meats could last months without spoiling. In sunny regions like the Mediterranean, figs, grapes, and herbs were laid on mats or hung from beams, allowing moisture to evaporate naturally. Once dried, these foods were stored in jars or sacks, ready for use in winter or trade. Root cellars remained vital in colder climates. These underground chambers provided stable, cool temperatures that slowed spoilage. Carrots, turnips, potatoes, and other root vegetables thrived in sand or straw beds. Families frequently checked their cellars, removing any spoiled items and carefully managing their supplies. The root cellar was both a pantry and a symbol of foresight. Ice pits and yakhchals showcased human ingenuity in hot climates. Ancient Persians harvested ice from mountains during winter and stored it in conical, insulated pits. These ice reserves preserved fruits, dairy, and meat for months, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of architecture and thermodynamics. The ability to maintain ice in desert heat was a marvel that supported both nutrition and social status. Preservation was also about community resilience. Granaries, communal cellars, and storage pits allowed entire towns to survive famine, drought, or conflict. Villagers contributed portions of their harvest to communal stores, creating systems of trust and mutual support. In many cases, these stores determined the survival of a community during hard times. Jars, amphorae, and barrels were indispensable. Their designs minimized exposure to air, moisture, and pests. Clay amphorae transported olive oil, wine, and grains across continents, while barrels carried salted fish and preserved meats. These containers enabled trade and helped civilizations flourish, connecting distant regions through the simple act of storing and moving food. Even small acts of preservation had cultural significance. Herbs hung to dry, fruits coated in honey, or cheese pressed and aged became traditions, shaping cuisines and culinary identities. Communities passed down these techniques, ensuring continuity and cultural cohesion. Preservation was practical, yes, but it also transmitted knowledge, taste, and heritage. Food storage also had psychological benefits. Knowing that supplies were safely stored provided security and peace of mind. Families could survive harsh winters, poor harvests, or travel without fear of starvation. Preservation was an expression of care, foresight, and human ingenuity, a buffer against the uncertainty of life. Trade and economy were deeply influenced by preservation. Salted fish, dried fruits, grains, and wine were valuable commodities. Merchants and sailors relied on preserved foods for long journeys. A well-stocked ship or caravan meant not just nourishment, but wealth. Preservation allowed societies to expand beyond local limits, enabling trade networks that connected continents. As with previous centuries, preservation shaped culinary innovation. Foods like pickles, fermented vegetables, smoked meats, and aged cheeses evolved from necessity into beloved cultural staples. What began as a survival technique became integral to identity, flavor, and tradition, creating dishes that define regions to this day. And here, as we pause in this narrative, it is important to honor the ingenuity of the past. If you are enjoying this exploration, please like this story and subscribe. Supporting these stories helps preserve knowledge of ancient wisdom, just as these civilizations preserved their food for the future. In conclusion, food preservation was a combination of science, art, and culture. Techniques like smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, ice storage, and root cellaring allowed humans to thrive across climates and centuries. They shaped economies, trade, culinary traditions, and social structures, Each jar, barrel, and pit tells a story of survival, foresight, and human creativity. Ancient food storage was far more than a practical necessity. It was a foundation for civilization. Without it, empires could not expand, cities could not flourish, and cultures could not develop. From the humble root cellar to the grand yakhchal, from salted fish to fermented cheese, every preserved food item carried life, knowledge, and heritage forward through time. As we journey further into the history of food storage, it becomes evident that ancient preservation techniques shaped societies in ways far beyond mere survival. These practices influenced trade, culture, cuisine, social structures, and even political stability. The ingenuity of humans in protecting their sustenance demonstrates a remarkable blend of science, observation, and tradition. One of the most widespread preservation methods was drying food. Across the globe, from the Mediterranean to Asia, people sun-dried fruits, vegetables, herbs, and meats. Drying removed moisture, which prevented bacteria and mold from developing. Sun-dried tomatoes, apricots, figs, and strips of beef or fish were portable, lightweight, and long-lasting. These dried foods became staples, not just in households, but in trade, often moving hundreds of miles to reach distant markets. Imagine a bustling village in ancient Anatolia. Mats of figs and grapes cover the courtyard, drying slowly under the hot sun. Children help turn the pieces, ensuring even exposure. By the end of the day, the aroma of sun-warmed fruits fills the air. Weeks later, these dried goods are carefully packed into clay jars, ready to sustain families during the winter months or to travel as part of regional trade. Salted preservation was equally crucial. Coastal and inland communities alike relied on salt to preserve meats and fish. Fish were cleaned, layered with salt, and stored in barrels, while meats were salted and cured for extended shelf life. Salt was a valuable commodity, sometimes even used as currency. Its production and trade shaped economies, influenced wars, and determined the prosperity of entire regions. Picture a medieval port town. Workers fill barrels with salted cod and herring, pressing each layer firmly to ensure coverage. Merchants inspect the barrels, checking for proper salting. These preserved fish will be loaded onto ships and traded inland, feeding families, armies, and travelers alike. Salted food enabled long journeys, military campaigns, and thriving commerce. Fermentation added another layer to preservation. Milk turned into cheese and yogurt, cabbage fermented into sauerkraut, and grains were brewed into beer. Fermentation not only extended shelf life, but also enhanced nutrition and flavor. Imagine a small village kitchen, jars of cabbage bubbling quietly, cheese wheels resting on wooden racks, barrels of beer fermenting slowly. Families relied on these foods daily, benefiting from both nourishment and taste. Root cellars played a vital role in temperate and cold regions. Dug underground, these chambers maintained stable temperatures and humidity levels, perfect for storing root vegetables like carrots, turnips, parsnips, and potatoes. Families inspected the cellars regularly, rotating vegetables, removing spoiled ones, and ensuring an uninterrupted food supply throughout harsh winters. The root cellar symbolized foresight, patience, and the quiet endurance of human survival. In hotter regions, ingenious structures, such as the Persian yakhchal, allowed a storage of ice and perishable foods despite extreme summer temperatures. Ice harvested during winter was stored in insulated conical pits, enabling fruits, dairy, and meats to remain fresh for months. This combination of architecture, climate understanding, and human labor represents a remarkable achievement in early refrigeration. Pickling was another method that spread across continents. Vegetables, fruits, and even meats were preserved in brine or vinegar. Pickled foods were portable, long-lasting, and added distinct flavors to diets. They became trade items, sustaining soldiers and travelers, and contributed to the culinary identities of many regions. Imagine jars of cucumbers, beans, and cabbage stacked neatly in a medieval pantry, waiting to provide nourishment and flavor in the months ahead. Even honey was a natural preservative. Its antibacterial properties made it ideal for storing fruits, nuts, and other foods. Ancient civilizations used honey not just as a sweetener, but as a way to extend the shelf life of delicate foods. Honey-coated fruits or nuts could last for months, demonstrating both ingenuity and the blending of practicality with taste. Communal preservation was another cornerstone of ancient societies. Granaries, shared ice pits, and town cellars ensured survival during poor harvests or famine. Families contributed portions of their harvest and in return had access to these stores. When times were hard, preservation became a social contract, reinforcing trust, cooperation, and community cohesion. Containers themselves were technological achievements. Clay jars, amphorae, barrels, and wax-sealed vessels minimized exposure to pests, air, and moisture. Amphorae transported olive oil, wine, and grains across seas, enabling trade and cultural exchange. Barrels carried salted fish and meats to distant markets. These containers were essential for both domestic storage and the growth of commerce. Psychologically, preserved food provided security and stability. Knowing that a cellar, jar, or barrel contained sustenance offered peace of mind. Families could plan for winters, festivals, and journeys without fear of starvation. Preservation was an expression of care, foresight, and intelligence, turning uncertainty into confidence. Trade, economy, and culinary innovation were deeply influenced by preservation. Dried, salted, or fermented foods were valuable commodities. Ships and caravans carried them across regions, supporting armies, merchants, and urban populations. Preservation enabled civilizations to expand, connect, and thrive beyond local limits. Furthermore, preservation shaped cultural identity. Techniques like smoking, salting, drying, pickling, and fermenting created regional flavors, cuisines, and traditions. Foods that originated as survival strategies evolved into cultural staples. Sauerkraut, kimchi, aged cheeses, salted fish, dried fruits. These foods carry the imprint of centuries of human ingenuity. As we pause here, it is fitting to reflect on the enduring legacy of these practices. If you are enjoying this journey through ancient food preservation, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Supporting these stories helps keep this knowledge alive, just as past civilizations preserved their food for the future. In conclusion, the combination of smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, ice storage, and careful cellaring enabled humans to survive, trade, and flourish. Each jar, barrel, and pit tells a story of ingenuity, patience, and resilience. Ancient food storage was far more than a necessity. It was a foundation for civilization, shaping diets, cultures, economies, and societies across millennia. As we continue exploring ancient food preservation, it becomes clear that these methods were as much about innovation and culture as they were about survival. Every jar sealed, every barrel packed, and every pit dug represented centuries of trial, observation, and ingenuity. One of the most universal methods was grain storage. Grains like wheat, barley, rice, and millet formed the foundation of civilizations. Protecting them from pests, moisture, and decay was crucial. Early societies built granaries, raised platforms, mud brick silos, and stone pits to keep grain safe. Granaries were often community managed, and in many cases controlled by local authorities or rulers to ensure fairness and prevent famine. Picture a bustling granary in ancient Mesopotamia. Workers pour heaps of golden wheat into a large mud brick silo. Children help smooth the surface, while elders seal the cracks with clay. Later, when food is scarce, this stored grain ensures the community survives. Granaries were not just storage spaces, they were vital centers of economic and social stability. Salting and smoking meats and fish were equally critical. Salted fish and meats could last months, feeding families, armies, and travelers. Smokehouses added both preservation and flavor, turning necessity into culinary art. Coastal towns relied heavily on these techniques, often creating entire trades around the process. Salted and smoked goods were transported inland, enabling trade and economic growth. Imagine a medieval port town. Barrels of salted herring line the docks. Smoke rises from wooden huts as fish hang above slow-burning fires. Merchants inspect every barrel, ensuring proper salting and storage. These preserved foods feed local communities and sustain traders on long journeys, proving that preservation was central to both survival and commerce. Dairy preservation was another significant innovation. Milk was transformed into butter, cheese, and yogurt. Butter, salted and stored in cool cellars, lasted months. Cheese could be pressed and aged for even longer periods. Yogurt provided nutrition while fermenting in clay pots. These methods ensured that protein remained available even when fresh milk was scarce. In arid regions, ice storage in yakhchals was revolutionary. Ancient Persians harvested ice from mountain streams in winter and stored it in conical, insulated pits. Inside these structures, fruits, meats, and dairy stayed cool despite scorching summer temperatures. The labor, design, and climate understanding required were remarkable, showing humanity's ability to adapt to extreme conditions. Drying was one of the simplest yet most effective preservation methods. Fruits, vegetables, and meats were laid out under the sun or hung in the wind to remove moisture. Sun-dried fruits like figs and apricots or strips of meat became portable and long-lasting. Families could store these foods in jars or sacks, providing sustenance during off-seasons or for trade. Pickling and fermentation were equally vital. Vegetables were preserved in brine or vinegar, milk fermented into cheese or yogurt, and grains brewed into beer. Fermentation extended shelf life, enhanced flavor, and sometimes improved nutrition. Picture a medieval kitchen. Jars of fermenting cabbage line the shelves, barrels of beer bubble gently, and cheese wheels rest on wooden racks. These foods were essential for daily meals, trade, and cultural rituals. Root cellars, dug underground in cooler climates, offered stable environments for storing vegetables, fruits, and beverages. Families carefully inspected these cellars, removing spoiled items and rotating stock. Root cellars symbolized foresight, patience, and resilience. Imagine a snow-covered northern village where families descend into damp, earthy cellars to retrieve carrots, turnips, and potatoes, sustaining themselves throughout the harsh winter. Communal preservation was another hallmark of ancient societies. Granaries, town cellars, and shared ice pits ensured survival during famine or poor harvests. Families contributed portions of their harvest, gaining access to these stores when needed. Preservation became a social contract, reinforcing trust, cooperation, and collective responsibility. Containers played a critical role in food longevity. Clay jars, amphorae, barrels, and wax-sealed vessels minimized exposure to pests, moisture, and air. Amphorae enabled trade across seas, while barrels transported salted meats and fish to distant markets. These simple tools facilitated commerce, cultural exchange, and civilization's growth. Preservation also carried psychological and emotional importance. A well-stocked cellar or jar represented security and peace of mind. Families could plan for winters, festivals, and travel without fear of hunger. Preservation turned uncertainty into confidence, demonstrating the deep human need for foresight and control. Trade and economy were deeply intertwined with preservation. Dried, salted, or fermented foods became valuable commodities. Merchants and sailors relied on preserved foods for long journeys, ensuring survival and economic growth. Preservation enabled societies to expand, trade, and connect across vast distances. Culinary traditions were also shaped by preservation. Techniques like drying, smoking, salting, pickling, and fermenting gave rise to regional flavors and dishes. Foods that were once survival strategies became cultural staples. Sauerkraut, kimchi, aged cheeses, smoked meats, and dried fruits reflect centuries of ingenuity and human adaptation. And here, as we pause, it is important to remember the value of these lessons. If you are enjoying this exploration of ancient food storage, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Just as ancient communities preserved their sustenance for the future, your support helps preserve knowledge and history for generations to come. Through a combination of drying, smoking, salting, fermentation, ice storage, and cellaring, humans mastered time and nature, ensuring survival, trade, and cultural development. Each jar, barrel, and pit tells a story of patience, innovation, and resilience, demonstrating that preservation was as much about civilization as it was about food. As we continue our journey through the history of food preservation, it becomes increasingly clear that these methods were foundational to civilization itself. Ancient peoples understood that the survival of their communities depended not only on growing or catching food, but also on protecting it from spoilage, pests, and seasonal scarcity. One of the earliest and most critical methods was grain storage. Wheat, barley, rice, and millet formed the backbone of ancient diets. Protecting these grains from moisture, insects, and rodents was essential. Granaries, ranging from mud brick silos in Mesopotamia to stone pits in Europe, kept grain safe. These structures often reflected social hierarchies, with authorities regulating access to stored grain to ensure fairness and prevent famine. Picture a bustling granary in ancient Egypt. Workers pour golden wheat into large mud brick silos carefully leveling the top. Children assist by smoothing the grains, while elders seal the edges with clay. Later, in times of scarcity, this stored grain sustains the community, ensuring survival. Granaries were not just storage spaces, they were central to economy, governance, and social cohesion. Salt and smoke were equally vital for preserving meats and fish. Salted foods could last months, feeding households, armies, and travelers. Smoke added flavor and extended shelf life, transforming necessity into culinary tradition. Coastal communities depended heavily on these techniques, creating entire trades around the production and distribution of salted and smoked goods. Imagine a medieval Northern European fishing village. Barrels of salted herring line the docks while smoke rises from the huts where fish hang above slow-burning fires. Merchants inspect the barrels meticulously, ensuring each layer of fish is properly salted. These preserved foods are not only sustenance, but also trade goods, sustaining commerce and travel. Dairy preservation was another significant innovation. Milk transformed into butter, cheese, and yogurt, each offering unique advantages. Salted butter, stored in cool cellars, lasted months. Cheese could be pressed and aged for extended periods. Yogurt provided nutrients while fermenting in clay pots. These methods ensured protein and calories remained available even when fresh milk was scarce. In hot climates, the Persian yakhchal was a marvel of engineering. Ice harvested from mountains in winter was stored in conical, insulated pits, keeping fruits, dairy, and meats cool during the scorching summer months. This innovation highlights not only ingenuity, but also humanity's ability to manipulate architecture and natural resources for survival. Drying was a universal and straightforward technique. Fruits, vegetables, grains, and meats were laid out under the sun or wind until moisture evaporated. Sun-dried foods were lightweight, portable, and long-lasting, making them suitable for storage or trade. Imagine a Mediterranean village where figs, grapes, and strips of beef dry slowly under the hot sun, their aroma filling the air. Once dried, they are packed into jars or sacks, ready for months of consumption or travel. Pickling and fermentation were crucial for both preservation and culinary development. Vegetables were pickled in brine or vinegar, milk fermented into cheese or yogurt, and grains brewed into beer. These processes extended shelf life, enhanced flavor, and sometimes improved nutritional value. Picture a medieval kitchen, bubbling jars of cabbage, barrels of beer fermenting gently, and cheese wheels aging on wooden racks. Families relied on these preserved foods daily, benefiting both nutritionally and culturally. Root cellars were indispensable in temperate and cold climates. Dug underground, they maintained stable temperature and humidity, perfect for storing root vegetables, fruits, and beverages. Families regularly inspected the cellars, rotated vegetables, and removed any spoiled items. The root cellar was more than storage. It symbolized foresight, patience, and the quiet endurance required to survive harsh winters. Communal preservation also strengthened social bonds. Granaries, shared ice pits, and town cellars ensured communities could withstand poor harvests or famine. Families contributed portions of their yield and could access communal stores when necessary. Preservation became a social contract, fostering cooperation, trust, and mutual reliance. Containers, such as clay jars, amphorae, and barrels, were technological marvels of their time. These vessels minimized exposure to pests, air, and moisture, enabling safe transport and storage. Amphorae carried olive oil, wine, and grains across seas, while barrels transported salted fish and meats inland. These containers were essential to trade networks that allowed civilizations to thrive. The act of preserving food also had psychological significance. A full cellar or neatly arranged jars offered reassurance and stability. Families could face harsh winters or failed harvests with confidence, knowing they had sustenance stored. Preservation transformed uncertainty into security, turning foresight into a tangible, life-sustaining practice. Trade and economy were profoundly influenced by preservation. Salted, dried, or fermented foods became commodities, supporting merchants, sailors, and entire economies. The ability to transport and store food enabled societies to expand beyond local limits, connecting regions and fostering cultural exchange. Preservation also shaped culinary traditions. Techniques like smoking, salting, drying, pickling, and fermenting created flavors and dishes that defined regions. Foods that began as survival strategies evolved into cultural staples: sauerkraut, kimchi, aged cheeses, smoked meats, and dried fruits all trace back to these ancient methods. As we pause in this narrative, it is important to reflect on the legacy of ancient preservation techniques. If you are enjoying this journey, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Just as ancient communities preserved their food for future generations, supporting these stories preserves knowledge and history for us today. Through smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, ice storage, and careful cellaring, humans mastered both time and nature. Every jar, barrel, and pit tells a story of ingenuity, patience, and resilience. Food preservation was more than survival. It was a foundation for civilization, enabling trade, culture, and society to flourish. As we delve further into ancient food storage, one thing becomes clear: preservation shaped the very structure of societies. From the humblest village to the grandest empire, the ability to keep food safe influenced survival, trade, culture, and governance. One of the most vital techniques was grain storage. Grains like wheat, barley, rice, and millet were the backbone of early civilizations. Protecting these staples from pests, moisture, and mold was essential. Granaries were constructed from mud brick, stone, or wood, sometimes elevated above the ground to keep rodents away. These granaries were not just practical, they were central to community planning and political power. Imagine an ancient Egyptian village during harvest season. Workers carry bundles of golden wheat to a towering mud brick granary. Elders seal the top with clay, children help level the piles, and families know that their future meals depend on this storage. These granaries ensured survival during lean months, maintained local economies, and even played a role in tax collection. Salted and smoked foods were also critical. Salt drew moisture from meat and fish, preventing bacterial growth, while smoking added both preservation and flavor. Coastal towns specialized in these methods, creating goods that were essential for long-term survival and trade. Salted herring, cod, and meats were packed in barrels and transported inland, feeding armies, traders, and families far from the source. Picture a medieval Northern European fishing village. Smoke curls from wooden huts as fish hang above smoldering fires. Merchants inspect barrels filled with salted herring, ensuring proper preservation. These preserved foods are essential not only for local consumption, but also for sustaining trade across regions. Dairy preservation was equally important. Milk was transformed into cheese, yogurt, and butter. Salted butter stored in cool cellars lasted for months, while cheese could be pressed and aged for even longer. Yogurt provided a nutritious option while fermenting in clay pots. These techniques ensured protein remained available even when fresh milk was scarce, making dairy a reliable food source throughout the year. In hotter climates, ice storage in Persian yakhchals showcased human ingenuity. Ice harvested from mountain streams in winter was stored in insulated conical pits, keeping fruits, meats, and dairy cool during scorching summers. These structures demonstrated an impressive understanding of insulation, architecture, and environmental control. Drying was another simple yet effective method. Fruits, vegetables, grains, and meats were left under the sun or wind until moisture evaporated. Sun-dried foods were lightweight, portable, and long-lasting, perfect for storage or trade. Imagine Mediterranean villagers spreading figs, grapes, and strips of meat under the hot sun. Once dried, these foods are stored in jars or sacks, ready for months of consumption or transport. Pickling and fermentation offered both preservation and culinary innovation. Vegetables pickled in brine or vinegar, milk fermented into cheese or yogurt, and grains brewed into beer. Fermentation not only extended shelf life, but enhanced nutrition and created flavors unique to each culture. Picture jars of bubbling sauerkraut, cheese wheels aging on racks, and barrels of beer fermenting quietly in a village kitchen. Root cellars were essential in colder climates. Dug underground, they maintained stable temperatures and humidity levels, perfect for storing vegetables, fruits, and beverages. Families inspected their cellars, removed spoiled items, and rotated stock, ensuring survival through harsh winters. Root cellars symbolized foresight, patience, and resilience. Communal preservation further strengthened social cohesion. Granaries, town cellars, and shared ice pits allowed communities to survive famine, drought, or conflict. Families contributed portions of their harvest and had access to communal stores during scarcity. Preservation thus became a social contract, reinforcing trust and cooperation. Containers, like clay jars, amphorae, and barrels, were technological marvels. Amphorae transported olive oil, wine, and grains across seas, while barrels carried salted fish and meats inland. These simple vessels enabled trade networks that allowed civilizations to expand and connect. The act of preserving food also had psychological significance. Knowing that a cellar, jar, or pit contained sustenance offered reassurance. Families could plan for winter, festivals, and journeys without fear of starvation. Preservation transformed uncertainty into security, turning foresight into a tangible, life-sustaining practice. Trade and economy were deeply influenced by preservation. Salted, dried, or fermented foods became commodities. Merchants and sailors relied on these supplies for long journeys, enabling trade, urban growth, and cultural exchange. Preservation allowed societies to flourish far beyond local limits. Culinary traditions evolved from these practices. Techniques like drying, smoking, salting, pickling, and fermenting gave rise to regional flavors. Foods that began as survival strategies became cultural staples. Sauerkraut, kimchi, aged cheeses, smoked meats, and dried fruits all reflect centuries of ingenuity and adaptation. And as we pause, it is important to honor the ingenuity of the past. If you are enjoying this journey through ancient food storage, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Supporting these stories preserves knowledge and history, just as past civilizations preserved their food for the future. Through smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, ice storage, and cellaring, humans learned to master both time and nature. Each jar, barrel, and pit tells a story of patience, resilience, and innovation. Preservation was more than survival. It was a foundation for civilization, trade, culture, and society itself. As we near the end of our journey into ancient food storage, one thing is abundantly clear. The preservation of food was a cornerstone of civilization, from survival to trade, from culinary tradition to social cohesion. The ability to store food shaped societies across continents and centuries. One of the most foundational techniques was grain storage. Grains such as wheat, barley, rice, and millet were the backbone of early human sustenance. Protecting these grains from pests, moisture, and mold was essential. Granaries, constructed from mud brick, stone, or wood, kept grain safe and often reflected political and social hierarchies. Authorities regulated access to these stores, ensuring fairness and preventing famine. Imagine an ancient Mesopotamian village at harvest. Workers carry bundles of golden wheat to a tall mud brick granary. Elders seal cracks with clay. Children smooth the surface, and families know their survival depends on these stores. Granaries were not just practical, they were symbols of stability, governance, and community resilience. Salting and smoking were equally critical for preserving meat and fish. Salt drew moisture out of foods, preventing bacterial growth, while smoking added both flavor and protection. Coastal communities specialized in these techniques, creating products that could last months and be traded over long distances. Salted fish, salted meats, and smoked goods became central to commerce, nutrition, and long-term survival. Picture a northern European fishing village. Smoke rises from huts as fish hang above smoldering fires. Merchants inspect barrels of salted herring, ensuring preservation for transport inland. These preserved foods sustain local families and enable long-distance trade, highlighting the importance of preservation to both survival and economy. Dairy preservation was another remarkable achievement. Milk was transformed into butter, cheese, and yogurt, each offering unique benefits. Salted butter stored in cool cellars could last months. Cheese could be pressed and aged, and yogurt, fermented in clay pots, provided nutrients for extended periods. These methods ensured protein availability even when fresh milk was unavailable. In hot climates, the Persian yakhchal was a marvel. Ice harvested during winter was stored in insulated conical pits, keeping fruits, dairy, and meat cool through scorching summers. This early refrigeration system demonstrated an advanced understanding of architecture, insulation, and environmental control. Drying was one of the simplest yet most effective methods. Fruits, vegetables, grains, and meats were laid in the sun or wind to remove moisture. Sun-dried foods became portable, lightweight, and long-lasting. Imagine Mediterranean villagers spreading figs, grapes, and strips of meat under the hot sun. Once dried, they were stored in jars or sacks, providing nourishment for months or for trade across regions. Pickling and fermentation were essential for preservation and culinary innovation. Vegetables pickled in brine or vinegar, milk fermented into cheese and yogurt, and grains brewed into beer. These techniques extended shelf life, enhanced nutrition, and added flavor. Picture a medieval kitchen: jars of bubbling cabbage, cheese wheels aging on racks, and barrels of beer fermenting quietly, sustaining families and shaping culinary traditions. Root cellars were critical in temperate and cold climates. Dug underground, these chambers maintained stable temperatures and humidity levels, ideal for storing root vegetables, fruits, and beverages. Families inspected the cellars, rotated stock, and removed spoiled items. Root cellars symbolized foresight, patience, and resilience. Communal preservation strengthened social bonds. Granaries shared ice pits, and town cellars allowed communities to survive famine or drought. Families contributed portions of their harvest and gained access to communal stores when necessary. Preservation became a social contract, fostering trust, cooperation, and interdependence. Containers like clay jars, amphorae, and barrels were essential to both domestic storage and trade. Amphorae transported olive oil, wine, and grains across seas, while barrels carried salted fish and meats inland. These vessels minimized exposure to air, moisture, and pests, enabling civilizations to thrive and trade over long distances. Preservation also offered psychological and emotional security. A full cellar or neatly arranged jars reassured families that sustenance was available during winters, festivals, and times of scarcity. Preservation transformed uncertainty into confidence, demonstrating foresight and care. Trade and economy were closely tied to preservation. Salted, dried, and fermented foods became commodities. Merchants and sailors relied on them for long journeys, supporting urban growth, trade networks, and cultural exchange. The ability to preserve and transport food allowed societies to expand beyond local limits. Culinary traditions grew out of preservation practices. Techniques like smoking, salting, drying, pickling, and fermenting created regional flavors and cultural identities. Foods that were once survival strategies became staples of heritage and taste. Sauerkraut, kimchi, aged cheeses, smoked meats, and dried fruits all reflect centuries of ingenuity. As we reflect on these achievements, it is important to honor the past. If you are enjoying this journey through ancient food storage, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Supporting these stories preserves knowledge, just as ancient communities preserved their sustenance for future generations. Through drying, smoking, salting, fermentation, ice storage, and cellaring, humans mastered time and nature. Every jar, barrel, and pit tells a story of innovation, patience, and resilience. Food preservation was more than survival. It was the foundation of civilization, trade, culture, and societal growth. As we conclude our journey through ancient food storage, one truth becomes abundantly clear. The preservation of food was a cornerstone of human civilization. Across continents and centuries, societies devised ingenious methods to protect their sustenance, ensuring survival, enabling trade, and shaping culture. At the heart of preservation was grain storage. Wheat, barley, rice, and millet were essential staples. Protecting them from moisture, pests, and mold required innovation. Granaries, mud brick silos in Mesopotamia, stone pits in Europe, and raised wooden bins in Asia kept grain safe. These structures were often community managed and regulated by authorities, ensuring equitable access and preventing famine. Picture an ancient Egyptian harvest. Golden wheat is poured into a towering granary. Children smooth the surface, and elders seal cracks with clay. This stored grain guarantees the survival of families, villages, and even the stability of entire regions during lean months. Granaries were not mere storage, they were symbols of foresight, governance, and social cohesion. Salting and smoking preserved meats and fish across the world. Salt drew moisture from food, preventing bacterial growth, while smoking added both flavor and durability. Coastal towns became centers for these trades, producing salted and smoked goods that could last months and travel long distances. Salted fish and meats fed families, armies, and merchants, underpinning local economies and long-distance trade. Imagine a medieval northern European port. Barrels of salted herring line the docks. Smoke rises from wooden huts, and merchants inspect each barrel for quality. These preserved foods sustain communities and fuel trade, proving that preservation was as crucial for economy as it was for survival. Dairy preservation provided another vital source of nutrition. Milk transformed into butter, cheese, and yogurt, each method extending its shelf life. Salted butter stored in cool cellars lasted months. Cheese could be pressed and aged, and yogurt fermented in clay pots offered protein and probiotics. These methods ensured reliable nutrition year-round, even in the absence of fresh milk. In hot climates, ice storage in Persian yakhchals amazed observers. Ice harvested in winter from mountain streams was stored in insulated conical pits, keeping perishable foods cool throughout scorching summers. These early refrigeration systems demonstrate the remarkable ingenuity of ancient civilizations and their ability to manipulate the environment. Drying was a simple yet effective preservation method. Fruits, vegetables, grains, and meats were laid out under the sun or wind until moisture evaporated. Sun-dried foods became portable, lightweight, and long-lasting. Imagine Mediterranean villagers spreading figs, grapes, and strips of meat under the hot sun. Once dried, these foods were stored in jars or sacks, providing months of nourishment and trade goods. Pickling and fermentation were essential for extending shelf life and enriching diets. Vegetables were pickled in brine or vinegar, milk fermented into cheese or yogurt, and grains brewed into beer. These processes not only preserved food, but enhanced flavor and nutrition. Picture a medieval kitchen. Jars of sauerkraut bubbling, barrels of beer fermenting, and cheese wheels aging on racks, all supporting both sustenance and culture. Root cellars in colder regions provided stable, cool environments for vegetables, fruits, and beverages. Families inspected their stores regularly, rotating items and removing spoiled goods. Root cellars represented foresight and resilience, allowing survival through harsh winters and unpredictable seasons. Communal preservation strengthened social bonds. Granaries, town cellars, and shared ice pits allowed communities to survive famine, drought, or conflict. Families contributed portions of their harvest and accessed communal stores when needed. Preservation became a social contract, fostering cooperation, trust, and mutual support. Containers, clay jars, amphorae, and barrels were vital to preservation and trade. Amphorae transported olive oil, wine, and grains across seas, while barrels carried salted fish and meats inland. These vessels minimized exposure to pests, moisture, and air, enabling civilizations to grow, connect, and thrive. The act of preserving food also provided psychological security. A well-stocked cellar, jar, or barrel offered reassurance, turning uncertainty into confidence. Families could face winters, festivals, and long journeys, knowing that sustenance was available. Preservation was both practical and symbolic, a testament to human foresight. Trade and economy were inseparable from preservation. Salted, dried, and fermented foods became commodities that sustained merchants, armies, and urban populations. Preservation allowed civilizations to expand geographically, connect through trade networks, and flourish culturally. Culinary traditions evolved from these practices: smoking, salting, drying, pickling, and fermenting shaped regional flavors and food identities. Dishes such as sauerkraut, kimchi, aged cheeses, smoked meats, and dried fruits all originated from these preservation methods, reflecting centuries of human ingenuity and adaptation. As we close this exploration, it is important to reflect on the enduring legacy of these techniques. If you are enjoying this journey through ancient food storage, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Your support ensures these lessons of human innovation continue to reach audiences today. Through drying, smoking, salting, fermentation, ice storage, and cellaring, humans mastered both time and nature. Each jar, barrel, and pit tells a story of resilience, ingenuity, and patience. Ancient food preservation was more than survival. It was a foundation for civilization, trade, culture, and social structure. The wisdom and creativity of past societies continue to inspire and inform our understanding of human resilience.